The story begins with a tense, dramatic scene. A brutal gang of racists targeting the wrong man, a business owner who they assume is weak and defenseless. But what they don't know is that he's a former Special Forces operative, a man trained to eliminate threats before they even know what hit them. Before we dive into this thrilling story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy gripping, action-packed narratives, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the quiet streets of the neighborhood, where resilience thrived despite the faded storefronts and cracked sidewalks. Carter's Market stood at the corner of 5th and Maple, a small but essential grocery store that had become a lifeline for the community. Behind the counter, Brandon Carter, the store's owner, adjusted the security monitor, his sharp eyes scanning the feed. He had been trained to notice the little things, subtle movements, hidden threats, the unspoken tension in the air. His military career was behind him, but his instincts had never faded. That's when the doorbell chimed. The first man to step inside had a swagger in his walk, his eyes scanning the shelves with a mix of disdain and greed. Two more followed, their presence heavy with unspoken threats. The leader, Gary, leaned on the counter, his sharp eyes studying Brandon like a predator assessing its prey. "Nice place you got here," Gary smirked, tapping his fingers against the counter. "Real nice. Looks like you do good business." Brandon didn't respond right away. He let the man's words settle, watching him like a chess player waiting for his opponent's first mistake. "We get by," he finally said, his voice steady. Todd, the stocky one, wandered down an aisle, picking up a box of cereal and turning it over in his hands before tossing it back onto the shelf. "Bet business could be better, though," Todd mused, his voice carrying over the shelves. "You know, with the right kind of help." Brandon's posture didn't change. "We don't need any help," Gary chuckled, shaking his head. "That's the thing about people like you, always so proud. Think you can do it all on your own. But pride's expensive. And from where I'm standing, it looks like you can't afford it." Brandon held his gaze. "Is that so?" Mike, the lanky one by the door, let out a nervous chuckle. "Man, Gary, this guy's got balls. Standing there all calm like we're just here to buy groceries." Gary shot Mike a sharp look, silencing him. Then he turned back to Brandon, his tone dropping into something darker. "We're not asking for much," he said, his voice almost friendly. "Just a little cut. A small fee to make sure nothing happens to this nice little store of yours." Brandon's jaw clenched. He'd seen this before. Extortion. Strong-arm tactics. A test. He straightened. "Nothing's going to happen to my store." Gary's smirk faltered, but only for a second. "You hear that, boys? He thinks he's untouchable." Then he motioned toward Todd. "Show him what happens to guys who don't want to play ball." Todd grinned, grabbed a glass jar from the shelf, and held it up. "This stuff's expensive. Think it'll break if I drop it." Brandon stayed silent. Todd let the jar slip from his fingers. Smash. The sauce splattered across the tiles, the sound sharp in the silence that followed. Brandon exhaled through his nose. "You're cleaning that up?" Todd's grin widened. He stepped forward, the crunch of broken glass under his boot deliberate. "Oh, I don't think so, old man. But you can clean it up. Ain't that what you're here for?" Mike shifted uncomfortably by the door. "Hey, maybe we should chill out." "Yeah? This guy doesn't look like he's gonna roll over." Gary snapped, "Shut up, Mike." Then he turned back to Brandon. "See, this guy needs to learn how things work around here. We're doing him a favor, and he's spitting in our faces." Brandon tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "This isn't how things work around here. And you're not doing me any favors. All you're doing is making a mess." Gary laughed humorlessly. "You hear that? He thinks he's got options." He leaned in closer. "Let me tell you something, old man, you don't." Todd stepped closer, arms crossed as he loomed over the counter. "You'll find out soon enough. Unless, of course, you want to make this easy. Sell the store now. And we know people who'd love to take it off your hands. Brandon met his gaze. I'm not selling. Not today. Not ever. Gary's smirk twisted into frustration. You're gonna wish you did, he muttered. Then he stepped back, nodding toward the door. Let's go, boys. The three men walked out, slow and deliberate, daring Brandon to stop them. When the door finally shut behind them, Brandon allowed himself a deep breath. He knew they would be back. Men like that never walked away after being challenged. And when they did, they'd learn exactly who they were messing with. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Carter's Market, casting long shadows across the shelves. The store was quiet, but Brandon Carter was far from at ease. He had spent the night preparing, not just the store, but himself. Because he knew they were coming back. He double-checked the locks, ensured the cameras were working, and ran through a mental checklist. He didn't just own this store, he protected it. And soon, he'd have to prove it. By midday, the rumble of an engine cut through the silence. They had arrived. Brandon glanced at the security monitor. The same battered pickup truck. The same three men, but this time, their demeanor was different. More confident. More dangerous. The bell above the door chimed as Gary swaggered in first, his smirk wider than before. Well, he drawled, spreading his arms as he sauntered toward the counter. Look who's still here. Thought maybe he'd gotten smart overnight and packed up. Brandon didn't flinch. I told you before, he said evenly. This store isn't going anywhere. Todd snorted, picking up a can of soup from a nearby shelf, tossing it lazily into the air. You've got guts, old man, he said. I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered. Mike leaned against a display rack, grinning. And this time, we're not just here to talk. Brandon's hand hovered near the alarm beneath the counter. He was ready. Gary stepped closer, his voice dropping into something low and menacing. You should have listened yesterday. Brandon pressed his palm against the alarm. Silent. Activated, the police would be on their way. But this fight? This fight was on him. Gary leaned in, his breath warm, his smirk a mask over something much darker. Now we've got to make an example out of you. Todd swung first. His fist came fast, aimed straight for Brandon's face. But Brandon wasn't just a store owner. He sidestepped smoothly, catching Todd's arm mid-swing and using his own weight against him. With a sharp twist, he sent Todd stumbling into a shelf, cans crashing to the floor. Mike rushed forward next, a heavy wrench in hand. Brandon saw it a second too late. The metal connected. Not a full impact, but enough to graze his ribs. Pain flared up his side. He gritted his teeth. Mike came in again, emboldened, but this time, Brandon was ready. With a sharp pivot, he grabbed Mike's wrist, twisting it. The wrench hit the floor with a dull clang. Brandon drove his knee into Mike's gut, sending him gasping to the ground. Gary didn't hesitate. From the corner of his eye, Brandon saw the flash of steel. A knife. Gary lunged, the blade glinting under the fluorescent lights. Brandon dodged barely. The knife sliced through the sleeve of his shirt, missing flesh by an inch. He didn't wait. He grabbed Gary's wrist, twisting it hard. The knife hit the floor. Brandon kicked it away. Todd was back on his feet. Mike, too. And all three of them were pissed. Brandon exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. You really want to do this? He asked. Gary's smirk returned. We're just getting started. The store erupted into chaos. Todd threw a wild punch. Brandon ducked, countering with a sharp elbow to Todd's ribs. The man crashed into the counter, knocking over the register. Mike, regaining his breath, grabbed a crowbar from the debris. Brandon barely had time to react before the metal swung. He stepped back, the edge grazing his forearm. The pain barely registered. His mind was in combat mode now. Mike swung again. Brandon caught the crowbar midair, yanking it from Mike's grip before slamming it into his shin. Mike collapsed, groaning. Brandon turned. Too late. Gary tackled him, driving them both into the shelves. They crashed to the ground, scattered products tumbling over them. Gary was stronger than he looked. His fists rained down. One caught Brandon's jaw, snapping his head to the side. A second dug into his ribs. Brandon tasted blood. Gary laughed. "Not so tough now, huh?" Brandon spat blood onto the floor. Then he moved. With a swift practice motion, he wrapped his legs around Gary's torso, twisting them both over. Now he was on top. Gary's smirk disappeared. Brandon grabbed him by the collar, slamming his fist into Gary's face. Once, twice, a third time for good measure. Todd tried to pull him off. Brandon grabbed Todd's arm, twisting it. A sharp crack filled the air as Todd screamed, shoulder dislocated. Mike, barely standing, staggered toward them. Brandon, still on top of Gary, flung the nearest thing he could grab. A glass bottle of soda. It smashed into Mike's face, knocking him out cold. Silence. Gary wheezed beneath him, blood running from his nose. Todd moaned on the floor, clutching his shoulder. Mike was out cold. Brandon took a breath, lifting himself off Gary's bruised body. Then, sirens. Red and blue flashed through the shattered storefront. The police had arrived. Brandon stood there, breathing heavily, as the first officer stepped inside, hand hovering over his holster. His eyes scanned the wreckage, shattered glass, blood-streaked floors, overturned shelves, and 3 battered men groaning on the ground. The officer whistled low. "Damn. What the hell happened here?" Another officer, a woman, stepped in behind him, her gaze locking onto Brandon. "Sir, are you injured?" Brandon wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. "I'm fine," Gary groaned, rolling onto his side. "Arrest them," Brandon said simply. The officers moved fast. Cuffs snapped onto wrists. Gary, Todd, and Mike were hauled to their feet, their groans of protest ignored. As Gary was dragged toward the door, he lifted his head just enough to glare at Brandon. "You're gonna regret this," he growled. Brandon stared him down, his voice deadly calm. "You already do." Gary's face twisted in rage, but he couldn't fight anymore. The officers led the men outside. The store was a wreck. Brandon didn't care, because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The real fight was just beginning. Brandon Carter stood in the wreckage of his store, breathing hard. Blood dripped from his lip, his ribs ached, and his knuckles were raw. But none of it mattered. Gary, Todd, and Mike were gone, hauled away in handcuffs. The store was in shambles, but Brandon knew this wasn't over. Not yet, because the real enemy was still out there. The man pulling the strings. The man who sent those thugs to intimidate him, just like he had done to so many others. Vincent Harrington. Brandon exhaled, wiping his split lip. It was time to end this. The police had taken statements, dusted for prints, and reviewed the security footage. Detective Maria Alvarez lingered near the counter, arms crossed, watching Brandon. "You should go to a hospital," she said finally. Brandon shook his head. "I'm fine," she sighed. "Brandon, this is bigger than your store. Those guys? They weren't acting alone. They were working for Harrington. This is part of a coordinated effort to push people like you out of the neighborhood." Brandon nodded. "I know. I heard them talking." Maria tilted her head. "And you didn't think to mention that sooner?" Brandon gave her a knowing look. "Would you have believed me?" Maria hesitated. She couldn't argue with that. "You need to let us handle this," she said. Brandon let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "You think the cops are going to stop Harrington? You think a warrant scares a man like that?" Maria exhaled. "We're building a case. But we need evidence." Brandon's eyes darkened. "Then I'll get it." Maria shook her head. "Brandon, don't. I already started this," he cut in. "And I'm going to finish it." Brandon spent the rest of the day digging. Using contacts from his old military days, he pulled records, hacked into databases, and followed digital trails. And then, He found something. Property records. Shell corporations. A pattern of intimidation, arson, and forced sales, all linked to Vincent Harrington. But what stood out most was a location. An old warehouse on the outskirts of town. A place Harrington's people used to conduct business. And tonight, there was a meeting scheduled. Brandon's jaw tightened. Perfect. The warehouse was dark, but Brandon moved like a shadow, slipping through the gaps in security. Inside, he saw them. A small group of men, gathered around a table covered in documents, cash, and blueprints. And at the head of the table, Vincent Harrington. Brandon's fists clenched. Time to end this. Brandon wasn't reckless. He wasn't going to rush in and start swinging. He needed proof. So, he recorded everything. The conversations, the threats, the bribes. And when Harrington leaned over the table, tapping a community center blueprint, saying, "Burn it down. If they won't sell, we'll make them," Brandon had exactly what he needed. But then, one of the guards noticed him. "Hey!" The room exploded into chaos. Brandon moved first, grabbing a nearby chair and slamming it into the closest man's face. Harrington ran, but Brandon didn't care about him. Yet, he had to get out first. A thug lunged with a crowbar. Brandon ducked, driving a punch into the man's ribs before flipping him over the table. Another swung a pipe. Brandon caught his wrist, twisted, and sent him crashing into a pile of crates. But more were coming. Too many. Brandon grabbed the hard drive from the table, the one containing evidence of every illegal deal, and made for the door. A gunshot rang out. Wood splintered next to him. He didn't look back. He just ran. Brandon barely made it out before a black SUV sped away from the warehouse. Harrington was escaping. Not tonight. Brandon jumped into his car and hit the gas. The chase roared through the empty streets, headlights cutting through the darkness. Harrington's car swerved, trying to lose him. But Brandon was relentless. Up ahead, a red light. Brandon saw his chance. He slammed into Harrington's bumper. The SUV spun out, tires screeching. It crashed into a streetlight. Brandon was out of his car in seconds. Harrington staggered out, dazed. Brandon grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the hood. "This is over," Brandon growled. Harrington spat blood, sneering. "You think this changes anything? People like me don't go to prison." Brandon smiled. "No, but they fall." The sound of sirens filled the night air. Brandon let go just as Maria and her team surrounded them. Harrington's smirk disappeared. He was done. The courtroom was silent as Brandon testified. He told the jury everything, the threats, the attacks, the corruption. And then, the recordings played. Harrington's own words condemning him. The verdict was swift. Guilty. Harrington's face twisted in rage as he was led away in handcuffs. Brandon watched, calm and unshaken. It was over. He had won. Brandon returned to Carter's Market the next day. The damage was still there, the broken shelves, the cracked tiles. But the community was there too. People helped clean, rebuild, restock. And as he stood behind the counter, watching the neighborhood thrive, he realized. This fight wasn't just for him. It was for all of them. And together, they had taken back their home,